In your book, Demonetization Decoded, you say that the shock announcement of Prime Minister Modi on 8th November, which he described as a movement for purifying our country, had the explicit aims of dealing with the problem of terrorism and the challenge posed by corruption and black money. Obviously, these goals are laudable in themselves, and very few people would oppose them. The debate really hinges on the best means to achieve these goals in a way that does not cause damage to innocent people and the society at large. So, first, once again, let's just start by describing the event. What was demonetization in 2016? What was it supposed to do? And what actually happened?
Yeah, this is, in fact, I think it's possibly a unique experiment globally, because there have been cases where governments have said, okay, so and so currency is no longer going to be legally valid. But they have done that over a phased manner. They'll say, in Europe, they said the 500 euro note is no longer legally valid. But they've done that in a phased manner. In 3 months, 6 months, you go in, and they have exchanged that note at the banks for equivalent new notes that are still legally valid. Okay, so countries have done that in the past. This was an entirely different thing, where you suddenly went and said, the following notes are not valid: the 500 rupee note and the 1,000 rupee note, which are the large denomination notes in India. And they're not going to be valid from 4 hours from now. So he comes on television at 8 p.m. at night and says, from midnight, these notes will not be valid. Now, at that time, these notes accounted for 86% of the currency in circulation. 86%. Can you imagine? So you're basically saying, I'm taking all the currency out of the market. And India at that time was a fully cash dependent economy. It was about, we have different estimates, but around 95% of transactions were in cash, especially because we have a very large informal sector. So what you're really doing, you're really just stopping the blood circulation of a system. You're just saying, bam, that's it. No activity. Your money is worthless. So you can imagine the confusion, the chaos, the tragedies that emerged as a result. Because the next day, you can't do anything with the money you already have. You cannot buy petrol. You cannot go to a hospital and get treated. You cannot travel buy a ticket for travel. You cannot pay your workers with money that is now worthless. They thought, mistakenly, of course, they thought that corruption is only expressed in cash. And the extent of cash is an indicator of the extent of corruption. Now, both are completely false ideas. Okay, some of the most developed rich economies actually have very high proportions of cash. Japan, for example, I think it's still 85% cash economy. Okay, some others, even Germany, a lot of European countries use a lot of cash. So that's one angle, that it's certainly not the case that all cash is corrupt. Okay, it has different kinds of convenience. But the other point is that corruption today is not about cash at all, except in the very small things where, you're paying off the local constable, or you're trying to get out of a parking fee or something, you hand over some money. That if you leave the low-level corruption aside, most corruption, most illicit flows today are digital. And that's so evident across the world. That is, you have to do a completely different set of things to address that. Then there was the idea that this is how terrorists fund, through cash, that they are hiring kids to throw stones and so on, and they're giving them 500 rupee notes. So if you remove the 500 rupee notes, they won't be able to throw stones. Seriously, that was actually the argument, as if something like terrorism can be, resolved in this really simplistic and ridiculous manner. So, in fact, it was remarkable in that it did not meet a single one of the objectives that was stated. And when that became evident after a few months, then they changed the goalposts. Then they said, oh, well, actually, we wanted to digitize the economy. And this is one way of forcing digitization. But in fact, digital payments, online payments was already occurring. In fact, it would have happened anyway, because it's, in many cases, it's more convenient. And we had, the growth of digital apps, mobile phones, et cetera, that enabled much more digital transaction anyway. However, what did it do? So it didn't meet any of the goals that it was supposedly designed for. What did it actually do? It destroyed the informal economy. it put so much pressure. Suddenly, you have an informal economy that runs on cash, and there is nothing that you can do with that. The cash you have, you cannot use, because they were trying to be secretive about it. They hadn't even told. I'm told even the finance minister was involved only that day. The RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank, which is supposed to make that decision, was told to have a special meeting and made to take that decision that afternoon. As a result, nobody was prepared. The mints were unprepared. The state governments were unprepared. Everybody was unprepared. And so you had almost a breakdown of certainly the informal economy. The privileged people, including myself, who can operate on credit cards and mobiles and etc., we were okay. But the entire Indian economy, the informal sector that employs 85% of the people, and all of the others in the formal sector who also used to receive cash payments for daily wages and so on, suddenly there's no money. So the mints were only able to start replacing money several months later. There was such a shortage of basic cash to meet any of these needs. It took a full year for the system to generate the same amount of cash notes that they had before in terms of the value. And mind you, after that, by the way, the cash in circulation has kept increasing as well. So it's not the case that they got rid of the idea of using cash. There is more cash in circulation today than there was when there was demonetization. Okay? Because you destroyed the informal sector, it's not enough that immediately there were people who couldn't be paid, people who couldn't get basic necessities, people who couldn't get health care. All of that happened, of course. There were so many tragedies. But in addition to that, and people dying in queues waiting to collect money, people dying because they didn't get hospital access, terrible tragedies occurred. But also, this had a terrible negative multiplier effect. You reduce economic activity like this for a month, 2 months, and in some cases 3 months. Obviously, the people who would have earned, they're not earning, they stop spending. So you get negative multipliers. You get less and less and less ability to spend. And so instead of generating growth, you actually generated a steep decline from the kind of economy you would have had if you hadn't had demonetization. So it was a huge mistake. There is absolutely nothing that was right about it. But it was very much part of a strategy of governing, a shock and awe approach to governing, where you come with this big announcement and show how powerful you are and show how everybody is going to just have to respond to what you do. And you don't really care about the consequences. You're doing that to establish power. Something that Mr. Trump is also pretty good at, and definitely using that playbook of shock and awe tactics without much regard for the consequences. There was one other consequence, which is a purely political one, which is that what this also did is decimate the coffers of the opposition parties before a very important state election in India, in Uttar Pradesh, the most populous state. And we are told, and we have some indications, that some of the ruling party had prior information and they were able to shift out of the kind of cash holdings that they had. Whereas none of the opposition parties obviously had any idea. So they were completely decimated. And of course, this is a very important part of spending. Electoral spending, you probably know, is a very major element in determining results as well. And so definitely the ruling party benefited from this and did, in fact, win those important elections in Uttar Pradesh the next year.
You've said in your book that the stated goals were laudable, and we've already established the execution was shoddy. We didn't meet any of the goals. And there's also maybe a nefarious tactic of decimating the coffers of the opposition as well. But as a whole, do you think the intent was right, even if the execution was terrible? Was this a policy that was launched with good intentions, or do you think the intention was malicious as well?
I can't speak for the intention, but I can tell you that conceptually it doesn't make sense. As I said, this does not get rid of corruption. This does not get rid of terrorism. This does not do the things that you say it will do. So this way of doing demonetization could never have achieved its goals. It's true, it was done so badly that it did a lot more damage than it needed to have. But it could not have worked in terms of those goals in any case, because that's the wrong way to approach those problems.